Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Vintage Books Live. It is spring, and it's still light outside at 7 o'clock, which I'm very happy with. I'm also happy to have Curtis Chen with us tonight. Curtis is sci-fi fantasy writer,
Mhm.
mostly.
Yeah.
Um, and we'll get into the details of it. He's got a book coming out today. Um, and um, and then he's got a third book in the series coming out in the summer. So we're just going to chat about what he's been up to, what came out today, um, and what's happening this summer. So I'm going to start out by asking you just to introduce the series, not necessarily just the one book that came out today, but the whole series, if you don't mind. Just talk a
Okay.
little bit about the main character and what he's up to and that kind of thing. And then we'll jump into the release from today.
Okay. Sure. Yeah. And I guess first I'll introduce myself for people who don't know me. I'm Curtis C. Chen. My pronouns are he, him. I look like an Asian man with long dark hair and eyeglasses, and I'm sitting in my little writing shed in my backyard. And yeah, so this is it's the second book in the Kangaroo series. The first book was Waypoint Kangaroo, and the book that was re-released today is Kangaroo Too, Too. That was kind of my little joke, and they let me do it, so so we're stuck with it now. Yeah, and the main character, his code name is Kangaroo, and he is a spy, and this is a science fiction-y future, mainly because I want to have spaceships flying around. But he's a spy who has a very unique ability, which is he can open a portal and hide stuff in it. And there's some like I made up some sort of like physics stuff to explain exactly how the portal works because I wanted some sort of specific rules about this. It's essentially superpower and it's magic because we don't really know why he has it and he doesn't know exactly like how he does it, right? It's just something he can do with his brain. And he kind of talks about this a little, especially in the first book. But I wanted some as a writer and the guy making up the story, I wanted some very clear rules for myself about like, okay, like what exactly can he do with it? What can't he do with it? What are sort of the limits around it? And those in setting up those rules also help me define sort of, okay, so these are situations where it would be useful. And these are situations where it would not be useful. And obviously, because he's a spy, he has to like keep it a secret, so he doesn't want to use it like all the time where anyone can see it because then they know he's like in this world he is the only person that anyone knows of with any kind of superpower. But it is the future, so there are spaceships and some people like he has some like technological implants, so he can also do other things. But other spies might have those too. So yes, and yeah, it's also funny because the main character Kangaroo has this sort of sarcastic, snarky personality, and the books are all first person, so it's very much his voice the whole time. So if that's not your kind of thing, you might not enjoy them. Uh, yeah, and that was sort of my way of making it fun for myself as the writer, because it's one thing to like, there's been a lot of different kinds of, spy novels written in the past, and I read a lot of them growing up, which is why, I really enjoy the genre, but I wanted to do something a little different. And so having it be, this person with, a specific, secret ability, and also to give him the personality that he has, where he knows he's special, so he can get away with a lot of stuff, and he's still pretty young. So there's also that aspect of it where he wants to do his job, but he's kind of lazy. So he has his support team, which he leans on a lot, and you see some of them in the first book, and a little more in the second book, and the third book, which I'm still working on. They some of them get featured even more prominently, and that was as a series. That was kind of my way of progressively trying to open up the world a little. So now that you know about this thing, let's get into that a little more and show exactly what that is, and also developing the relationships. So anyone who's read a series or follow different characters, even if, it's on like a TV show or like in a movie franchise. Um, I feel like the thing as a storyteller that is interesting to do is to, take something that and even if it's something very episodic, it's like you can still kind of, keep pushing the characters a little more. Because in real life, people do sort of change over time, even though you
Yeah.
have,
Yeah.
like a core personality. But as come into contact with other different kinds of people, or like you have different experiences, that sort of alters how you're going to think about things or do things. And so I wanted to be able to work some of that into the Kangaroo books, even though I want each one to be mostly standalone. So like if like the 5-minute summary that I've given you, can kind of understand what's happening in
Right.
the story, and hopefully like all of the current state of the character relationships, mainly Kangaroo and like his support team. um, you don't need to know all the backstory. You just kind of can understand this is where they are now. And if you're interested, you can go back and read earlier books. If you happen to pick up just book 2 or book 3, you can go back to the earlier ones and see like, oh, this is how they got to where they are now, or
Yeah.
this explains that. But I very much wanted each book to be sort of its own mission or its own adventure, even though there's some continuity between them.
I'm curious, just a little bit more about Kangaroo's personality because I was
Mhm.
like picking up the books, reading flap copy again, and then, like going through your website and like reading some of the shorter stories and stuff that you've got out there. And I'm curious about Kangaroo, 'cause the flap copy of the first book is like yet another failed mission. So
Uh-huh.
I get the
Yeah.
feeling that maybe is the is that referring to his lack of experience, or is he just a little bit of an absent-minded professor type spy as well?
It's more the lack of experience, but also the fact that, because he knows he can get away with a lot, because he's the only person who can do like certain kinds of missions, right? Like in the first one, like without saying too much, like, it's the initial thing that opens the book is he's like on a mission to retrieve something, and the idea is he can hide it in the pocket. So like he opens a portal, he stuffs it inside and closes the portal, and it's just, you know, as far as anyone knows, it's kind of vanished, but he can like pull out again when he wants. So you can basically smuggle anything like in or out, across borders, and no one's going to know about it. Um, I mean, the one catch there is if you wanted to smuggle like a living person, you'd have to put him in a spacesuit first, because inside what he calls the pocket, uh, it looks like deep space, and that was kind of one of the rules I set up for myself to make it not as useful in every situation it could be. So if you
Yeah,
stuff someone in the pocket, they basically get shoved into deep space. So there's no air, there's no light, there's no gravity, there's no heat. So if it's a living person and they're not protected, then they will eventually like freeze and suffocate or whatever. And if it's an object, it will eventually get cool down and like basically be
yeah,
frozen.
yeah,
So so he also so there's also this thing of you know things that might get like frozen or like um be less useful when they're like ice cold. Like he's got to put them inside like this like thermal packaging, so like a bag that goes inside the pocket. And so yeah, so I made up all those rules for myself. Um and in terms of personality, it was I mean, I wanted something to sort of balance the 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 very real danger of like people are getting killed, or people are trying to kill him, or like other stuff is happening that's putting him or people he cares about in jeopardy. And for me, like as a reader, like I've certainly read a lot of novels where and especially thrillers that are very sort of gritty and everything was terrible all the time. And I kind of didn't want that for my story. And so my way into that was to make him as the character have a particular voice where he's always sort of got an attitude about everything.
yeah, yeah,
And I also um with certainly with science fiction, there's always this thing of, I'm writing about a future world, so I've like made up how spaceships work in this setting and all that, and people are living, on the moon and on Mars and in the asteroid belt and all that. Um, and but the people reading it are like living now, so sort of in my mind, there's like a lot of these things in terms of like how people are talking, even though the dialogue is very specific, it's sort of like this, I don't know, in uh it's hard to explain, but the way I think of it is like, I'm writing things a certain way so they make this kind of sense to a contemporary audience, even though like if it's the actual future, and like some science fiction writers sort of do this a lot better. And it wasn't something I wanted to attempt in this particular series, where they imagine a future that is very different from our own and try to portray that so a little more realistically, right? So in terms of like, languages will drift and like words with words will get spelled or pronounced differently. Just sort of naturally, like languages will evolve over time, just as people are using them and
Yeah.
making up new phrases or new expressions, and so that's going to change. So like 200-300 years from now, English is probably going to be sort of very, very different. If you think about
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
people spoke English 300 years before now, like in the what would that be, the early 1800s, right? Like there was, people were using different kinds of, phrasing and different ways of speaking, and even the way, the subject people like wanted to talk about or were willing to discuss, sort of, in
Right. Right.
public, were very different.
Yeah.
So yeah, so in my mind, there's always that kind of thing, and so I just wanted to like use the humor to make it a little more accessible to a contemporary audience.
I'm curious the idea of this pocket that then
Hmm.
could be used. What was the inspiration for that? Was that something that just popped into your head, or did something specifically inspire it, or were you just kind of brainstorming like what ability could this person have?
Yeah, so the specific inspiration, and if you get the first book, the author's edition, which is there, um, they're both in paperback and ebook.
They're at
In,
the store,
in
or the first one's at the store. The second one's
Yeah,
coming.
yeah, they will be there later this week. Um, yeah, so in the back of both of them, there's some bonus materials, which include some like promotional like blog posts I wrote when they both initially came out in hardcover. And so the specific inspiration for the pocket superpower was it's a Japanese cartoon character, which has been around for a long time. He's called Doraemon. And I read a lot of the comics when I was younger because they had been translated into Chinese. And so my paternal grandfather, like for a while, owned a bookstore in Taiwan, which is where I was born. So, when I was very, very young, I would like browse the shelves and start reading. And so that was one of the comic books that I read. And so Doraemon is a robot cat from the future. Just go with me on this.
I love that.
And he has he literally has a like, little pouch on his belly, which what do they call it? They call it like a four-dimensional gadget pouch. But he in the comic book, like he will basically reach into it and just pull out all kinds of stuff. And usually, and I actually reread the comics recently. They're originally, I don't know how they were originally released in Japan, but when I was reading, they were like collected into these little like manga books. And each comic is like very, very short, only a few pages, and they're very episodic. And each episode is about how, so Doraemon was sent back from the future to help, um, let me see, I remember the backstory, right? So he was sent back by his owner in the future to help that guy's grandfather in the past, who was while he was in like grade school, let's say, pretty young, still in school, and he
Yeah.
was like a terrible student and was being bullied and had all these other problems. And so his grandchild in the future said, "I'm going to send back this robot cat in a time machine that happens to be in his desk drawer. Don't
Of
ask too many
course, as one
questions. This
has
is it's
in
a
your desk.
cartoon. It's a comic. Um, and this robot cat is going to have this pouch where he's got stored all these gadgets from the future, which you can pull out and help, my ancestors. So basically, each episode, like little of the original comic, is like the kid. I don't remember his name in the original Japanese. In the Chinese translation, he was Dasho, and they just kind of made up a name for him, basically. Um, but each episode is like the kid will have some kind of problem, like he's being bullied, or like he needs to study for a test, or he like whatever it is. And then Doraemon will like, oh, well, I have a gadget from the future that might help with that. And
I'll
then the
solve
kid
your
will like
problem.
use it, and it inevitably goes wrong in like some ridiculous, right? Like either like he uses it wrong, or he abuses the power, whatever it is of the thing, um, or like his friends find out, and like one of the bullies steals it, and like it's a lot of sort of familiar tropes from kids shows, but in the with this sort of very science fictional um, feeling to it.
Yeah, yeah,
So I think that idea of like, oh, you could have a pocket where you could like hide everything, like kind of stuck with me over the
yeah,
years.
yeah,
And eventually I figured out how to make it into an ability that would make sense in a more like adult novel. Right?
yeah,
This
yeah.
like
There's this whole conversation in going on in YouTube chat right now about how they um are picturing crossovers, and also they need to read this book. So I'm gonna have to we'll have to see if it has a
okay.
I'll have to look
Yeah,
it up and see if it has a
yeah,
like an
yeah.
English
It's
translation or
yeah,
something.
and Doraemon, like he's still around, and like he's really popular like all over like Asia, and even like Southeast Asia, like into like India and Pakistan, but he's never made it into the West. Like over there, he's like
Oh,
Mickey Mouse
bummer.
in Japan. Like you go to
Yeah,
Japan, like he's everywhere. But here, it's like not so much.
that's
It's just
interesting.
like just
Because
just one of those things. But yeah.
so much of a lot of manga has finally
Oh
made it
yeah, yeah,
here.
absolutely, yeah. But I
I
think
find it interesting the ones that don't for whatever
yeah.
reason.
But I think this one, like, it's definitely older, right? So, like, I was reading it in the 70s, so it was around, before then because it had been translated into Chinese by
Yeah,
then.
yeah,
And yeah, and it's very much sort of like aimed at younger kids, I feel like. And in terms of the, what the stories are about, it's always a sort of more of like, well, you can't really take a shortcut to like getting whatever you want to get, right? Like to like studying
yeah, yeah.
test, or like, making friends or whatever. It's like you can't depend on this futuristic gadget, and something always goes wrong with it. So
Somebody said a robot feline bag of holding, which I love.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, and the other thing about so, and the series, like there were a whole bunch of these comics, and then like later on there was also like a TV show, and they made a bunch of movies. Like in recent years, they've had like really big like movie releases like with the characters. Um, and what was I saying? Oh, and one of the things about Doraemon himself is like he's a robot cat, but they draw him as he's basically like a bunch of circles. And there's at some point in the comics, like they will travel into the future. They get a glimpse of the future, and he talks about like at some point the question comes up like, if you're a robot cat, why don't you look like a cat? Because he's got like whiskers, but he doesn't have ears. And the reason he doesn't have ears is because, in the future, like he uh, had ears, and like I remember like some mice like came and like chewed off his ears. So he's actually afraid of mice. And it's also like, so he's got all this anxiety, right? Which, a lot of us identify with. And that's
That's
part of the
funny.
reason why like the person in the future said like, okay, you're not that useful here, but you can go back and do this other stuff because you don't have to deal with so much of the future stuff.
See, now I feel cheated because we need this. We need this in English, apparently, or I
Yeah,
need to
you
learn
can find English
it.
translations. I found a few of them, but yeah, just never took a hold here.
So let's jump back to Kangaroo, because
Mhm.
honestly, we could probably talk
Sure.
about robot cats for the rest of the night, and everybody would be happy.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit now that we've kind of covered the overview of the series? Can you
Mhm.
talk a little bit about the book that comes out today?
Today, yeah. So it's Kangaroo 2 is officially out today, paperback and
Yay.
ebook, and you should be able to find it in most places. The distribution, I'm still figuring out a lot of the. So I'm self-publishing these. So I'm still figuring out
Yeah.
some of the distribution issues. So there may be a delay somewhere, but you can definitely get them through Vintage Books. You can get them in ebooks in a lot of places already. That part seems to be a
Yeah,
little
that
smoother
part's a
right
little
now.
bit less tricky to deal with.
Yeah. Um, Yeah, and so it's second book in the series. What can I say about it? It's I don't know. I mean, unless you have a specific question, I can talk about
Okay.
the
So the first one's set on Mars, second
uh-huh.
one's set on the moon. So you've created this world. Is it
Hmm.
expansive of the whole solar system in Kangaroo's world, or is it kind of near objects like the moon and Mars and the asteroid belt and that kind of thing?
Yeah, so my idea is that pretty much the whole solar system is accessible um in this future with the spaceships they have and how fast they can go. And I kind of hand wave how that happens. But he does mention I think in the very start of the first book how he's been to like a lot of different planets and usually he doesn't he doesn't usually work on Earth that much at the start of the first book. And there's um sort of backstory there that I haven't really explained. Um, but yeah, that was the other thing I kind of wanted to be able to play in terms of making this set in the future and specifically science fictiony because even a lot of contemporary spy fiction does have just this sort of slightly advanced technology that
Yeah,
is
yeah.
a little like science fictiony sometimes. But I definitely wanted one of the ways I was thinking to make each book feel like a different kind of adventure was to have a different setting. So the first one actually mostly takes place on a cruise spaceship that's going from Earth to Mars. The second one does take place mostly on the moon, but in the future, when there's like all these habitats, so some people are living there, but the moon's like a big tourist destination for various reasons, and
That seems reasonable. I
yeah, because it's like a lot of historic sites, like the
mean, if I
first.
could go to the moon as a tourist, I would totally do it. So
Yeah, yeah, and in both of the books, I kind of play with that idea a little bit because the first one, like, it's on basically a pleasure cruise ship,
yeah,
but it's a spaceship, and so even more so than like a a cruise ship now, because right now you go on a cruise, you're gonna like be at sea for some time, but then they're also gonna stop at different places along the way. Um, Whereas in space, you're going from so the way I set it up was they're going to go from Earth to Mars, and it was going to take about a week. But that whole week, you're just like out in deep space, like there's nothing around. So like everything has to be on the ship, and you're
yeah,
kind of trapped there. Um, so it's like even more of the stuff that you would see on a cruise ship now. It's like they're going to do more of that because they know
yeah,
like
yeah.
they don't want you to get
Gotta have stuff to
bored
do.
and like get into
Yeah.
trouble. Like we know you're going to drink, but
Well, I love the idea of that because I think it's like, it's like you talked about with language. I mean, language is something that absolutely changes
Mhm.
relatively quickly, actually, over time,
Yeah.
at least, slang and ways of using words and
Sure.
stuff.
Yeah.
But people in their essence, in some ways, don't change a whole lot. So the
Hmm.
idea that, we would have vacations and where will you go on vacation, a couple hundred years from now? And
Hmm.
going to Mars seems like a very reasonable place to go on
Yeah.
vacation or going on a space cruise or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah. No,
That I
absolutely. And this actually came up like I had the opportunity to visit a couple of book clubs for the when the first book came out. And so it was a group of people who had read the book, and then I just joined them for the discussion about it. It was interesting to hear um, different people's kind of reactions to the book, and with the first book, um, I was a little concerned when I was, writing it and then querying it and trying to like, sell it to a publisher that I felt like it was definitely a mashup of a bunch of different things, right? It was science fiction because like there's all this stuff in space and with
Yeah.
spaceships, um, and that's an important part of the plot. But it's essentially just a spy thriller. So like all the big problems of the plot are sort of very typical spy things, right? Like someone has a secret they don't want to be discovered, and then this other person is trying to find out the secret, and
Yeah.
people are
Yeah.
trying to like mess with each other's plans. And then there's also like this magical superpower piece of it, which is just like,
Yeah. Just
it's just
yeah.
I just wanted that in
So,
there. So,
yeah.
figuring out how to make all that work together, and then also it's funny, which I think a lot of people don't necessarily expect from a spy thriller.
Yeah.
So figuring out a way to make all that work together, like I spent a lot of time on the first novel, and I had a lot of early readers and critique groups that helped out a lot, sort of helping me sort of turn the dials on that so that it all kind of fit together and felt like it was all like all in the same world. Um,
So
yeah,
somebody in chat had, and this seems like a good place to stick it, where
yeah,
you've essentially opened up the world, and it sounds like it's the solar system, like
hmm
is
yeah.
a reasonable travel can happen within the solar system. Does it
Mhm.
happen outside of that, or is it pretty much contained within the solar system?
Right now, it's contained in the solar
Okay.
system.
And then they were wondering, like, where did you do research? What kind of research did you do to make it, like you're layering all your own, this is the world, this is
Mhm.
how they travel and everything, but
Yeah.
what did you underpin that with research wise to make it believable that, these things could really happen?
Okay. Well, I mean, in some senses, I've kind of been, researching my whole life because
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
a big Star Trek fan.
Yeah. For those
Um,
of you who are listening who can't see, Curtis has is that the original Enterprise in
yeah,
the
it's the
background?
original
Yeah, he's got a
Enterprise.
model of the original Enterprise from Star Trek in the background, and it's got cool flashing lights.
Yeah. And I read a lot of, different kinds of science fiction growing up, and I still like read a lot of it and, and watch a lot of it. Like there's sort of a lot of really good stuff available now in terms of like movies and TV
Yeah.
shows also, which I feel like is sort of, there are some advantages to being able to like show something visually, but then also I feel like, if you're writing about the future, or a story set in the future. If you're describing something in a novel, you can sort of, as a writer, if you're writing prose, like you kind of have a little like kind of slider you can use to like how much you describe and how much you let the
Yeah.
reader imagine.
Yeah.
So you can say, oh, a thing that looks kind of like a certain kind of architecture or whatever, or you can filter it through a specific character's point of view, and it's only what that character might notice. Whereas if you're making like a TV show or a movie, like
Yeah.
you literally have to come up with like what are you going to put
What does it look
on
like?
screen,
Yeah.
and everyone's going to
Yeah.
see the same thing, and they might describe it differently, but everyone's going to see like just the same thing. And how do you make that? Um, and that can, in some ways, it can be harder to convey a specific sense of the future that you want when you have to like basically just
Yeah.
make an image. And it's kind of like the old ink blot Rorschach test, right, where they like put up an image like what does this look
Yeah.
like, right?
Yeah.
And you can make like New York with like all these like extra new like taller buildings or like weirdly shaped buildings, and that's gonna hit different people differently. Whereas if you're describing a book, uh, describing it in a book, you can actually sort of give some of the stuff that's not visible, right? Like you can talk about like, oh, like, well, New York, in 100 years before this, like this thing happened, and that's why the buildings now look like this, or that's why, you know, they're taller now, or that's why there's a lot of, like, whatever kind of weird new architecture thing there is in that world. Um, so yeah, so I definitely thought about, a lot of things like that. And with Kangaroo, because it's all first person, I feel like there's definitely some places where I cheated a little bit because like this is I decided like this is not a thing that he's going to know about. So he's just going to sort of describe very vaguely what he's looking at. And then maybe
Yeah.
someone else will tell him in dialogue if I need that. If I feel like the reader needs that information for the story to make sense, but otherwise, I definitely gloss over a lot of stuff in terms
Yeah.
like there's a lot of there ends up being a bunch of military stuff because he's a spy, and spies are always sort of military adjacent anyway. But he doesn't like character Kangaroo himself doesn't know a lot about firearms. So like he's not gonna like tell you exactly what make and model the gun is. And in a way, he's like
Yeah.
he picks up a
Yeah.
gun and literally doesn't know how to use it. And I find that hilarious personally.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a spy, but he's like, I've never seen this before. I don't know.
I think that, I mean, this is probably another topic that we could like go off on for a while,
Mhm.
and I will bring it back to something else so that we don't do that. But I do think it's interesting the conversation that you had about um the limitations of the visual,
Mhm. Yeah.
because I think, and I suspect that's why so many people end up being disappointed by a movie, is
Mhm.
that not that the people who created it did such a terrible job. I mean, sometimes that's that, but sometimes it's just the filmmaker's vision of whatever was in the book
Mhm.
isn't
Sure.
like what
Yeah.
you pictured in the book.
Yeah,
Whereas a
exactly. Yeah.
book, 300 people can read it, and they can each, it can be to each person whatever
Mhm.
they want it to be, or whatever
Yeah,
they
yeah.
put in their mind. And
Yeah,
I think that
absolutely.
that's
And
interesting.
I think that's what happens with all adaptations. I think you have the source material, but then whoever is making the adaptation sort of gets to put their own spin on it. So, I mean, a lot of people have been talking about like the latest Dune movies, right? That
Yeah, yeah,
Denis Villeneuve made, and that is his very particular vision of it. Um,
right, right.
and you can still like go and read the original books, and they'll give you like a lot of other stuff that some people are like get really excited about. Um, and there's a documentary that you can watch called Hodorowski's Dune, which is about back in the 70s or 80s, like um, decades ago. This Spanish filmmaker was trying to make his own version of Dune,
Yeah,
and it never happened. But
right, right.
the documentary filmmakers went back and like interviewed him and interviewed a bunch of other people that were involved with the project. And he had like at the time he had made like this whole like this giant like book of like concept art and like storyboards and all this stuff to like take to like a movie studio and say, will you pay for us to like make this movie?
Yeah,
And it was
yeah,
kind of wild, and it's hard to say like how much of it is like actually what happened, based on these people's recollections. But it's interesting
yeah,
because they do talk to Hodorowski himself at one point, and he definitely had a very specific vision for what he wanted to make. And in the end, I would say it was only sort of loosely based on the actual like Dune book, and what
yeah,
the book was
yeah,
about. And like I think with the latest like Dune Part Two, like people have talked about how like the timeline is different than the books, right? Because in
right,
the
right.
books, there's sort of a lot of future history that gets covered. In the movie, it's sort of compacted
Kind of
into like a
compressed it.
much
Yeah, yeah.
smaller sort of timeline of incidents. But again, you know, for the purposes of telling you this visual story, that kind of made sense to
Yes,
that
yeah,
director and the
yeah.
people making that.
And I think what really happens is they end up being, it's like the Lord of the Rings movies too. They end up
Hmm.
being two very different pieces of art.
Hmm.
You know, they're
Oh
it's
yeah,
almost like
absolutely.
it's almost like they're based on the same story, but they inevitably have to tell
Hmm.
it in such a different way that they end up being they're each
Right.
their own
Yeah,
thing.
yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah.
So,
And so, I think there definitely, I mean, there have been some, I think, objectively bad adaptations, but
yeah,
for the
yeah,
most part, I would say that it's just a matter of like how are you going to adapt something, especially like the Jeff Vandermeer's novel Annihilation, right? Like I read the novel, and I heard that what's his name, Alex Garland was going to make a movie out of it, and when I heard that, I was thinking to myself, like, I have no idea how he's actually going to do this because, like, in the book, in that book, which is it does a lot of stuff really brilliantly, but there's a lot of sort of unreliable narrator, like first person stuff where, and not to spoil or anything, but a lot
Yeah.
of it is, it has, for me, it had that kind of feel of like, is this what's really happening or is this person just
Yeah.
slowly going insane? And I'm like, how are they going to do this in the movie? Because you can't exactly do that. And to their credit, they did something kind of similar, but it was the same sort of thing where like either you have to show something, or you have to find a way, sort of like in a horror movie sort of way to like not show the thing, but maybe show like a shadow of it, or like
Yeah.
show. And so I do think the adaptation of that succeeded in a lot of ways. Apparently, had other kinds of issues because the book is actually the first in the series, and then I think they wanted to make more of the films, but as they were getting to the end of the first one, they realized like they weren't going to get to. So
Yeah. Yeah.
so the ending of the film, I think, is not everything that could have been. But
Well,
yeah, I mean,
that actually kind of segues into
yeah,
what I was going to jump back into now
okay.
for your stuff. I
Hmm.
mean, these books have been on kind of a heck of a journey
Yeah, a little
because
bit.
they
Yeah,
came out, I don't remember what year they came out originally in hardcover.
yeah. The first one was 2016, so
Okay.
it's been
Okay.
almost eight
Yeah.
years now.
And I mean, I think for people who are readers but haven't um had the opportunity to have a like sort of back end view of the publishing
Hmm.
world. The same thing happens in publishing as happens to your favorite TV show that got 5 episodes and then they
Oh yeah.
decided not to do it.
Hmm.
And it could be like really good TV show. It often
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily have to do with how good it was, or even sometimes how many people are watching it, or maybe lots of people are watching it, but not quite enough people are watching it. I
Hmm.
mean, there's all kinds of
Yeah.
reasons that stuff doesn't make it so in this case books
Hmm.
1 and 2 came out and then
Yeah.
you've got an idea for book 3
Yeah.
and it doesn't happen, and so then you're on a journey to get it back so that you can do your book 3.
Hmm.
What drove you in that journey to really just want to keep going with it? Like, what about the kangaroo character makes you want to keep going enough that you go through all this difficult process of getting the books back?
Yeah, and to be fair, I mean, for me, it wasn't actually that difficult. I just kind of had to wait it out for uninteresting publishing contract reasons.
Yeah,
But there
yeah.
wasn't, I
We
didn't
don't
have
have
to,
to we don't
yeah,
have to get
I
and
didn't have to
honestly,
fight with
a
the
lot of times those are
publisher or like hire a
confidential.
lawyer or anything like that. It
Yeah.
was very straightforward in the end. But I did like so I haven't sold another novel to a publisher at this point. It was just these two, which were, in the same contract. But I've written a lot of other stuff, and like doing the first two books with it was with a Macmillan imprint. Um, Definitely opened up a lot of other opportunities for me. So I'm very grateful for that. And I, working on the books, the original hardcovers, and also the audiobooks. Like that was a great experience. I was really happy with the way they treated me overall.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but they just, I think the first two books didn't make as big a splash as they were kind of hoping they would. And so,
Yeah.
ultimately it's their decision. But now that I have the rights back, so I'm putting out the first two again, and then I'm going to continue the series. And we always talked about it as a series, and I think that's one of the really great things about my publishing experience with this series is that when we were selling the first book, and again that was my debut novel as a writer. So I had, spent, 10 years or 8 years writing it. And then I started querying agents, got an agent, and then we went out on submission to different publishers. and then ended up two publishers wanted it, and so I like had to decide which one to go with. Um, and but we had always talked about it as a series, and in the end, like talking to my agent and talking to the editor that I ended up working with at Macmillan, like we all kind of agreed on what the series was and what the first book was. And the two of them had different notes from their perspectives about how to make the first book better. In terms of my editor had a lot of really great notes about the pacing because it was supposed to be a thriller, and he wanted to be a page turner. So and he's done a lot of that in his career. So he had really good notes about tightening up the pacing. And my agent um, had a lot of notes about sort of dialing in the humor
Yeah.
and and making that fit into the context of the whole like spy story and whatever. So yeah, so we'd always talked about it as a series, and in action. So I'll just tell a short sort of aside for anyone interested in how publishing works. I actually, so when we went out on submission with the first book, my agent asked me to come up with pitches for like two more books in the series because we had agreed that we want this to be a series. If it doesn't go, it's fine. We'll just sell the first one. But if we can get a publisher interested, we want this to be a whole series, and who knows how long. I was kind of leaving it open-ended. So I'd come up with pitches for like two more books, just like one paragraph things.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and this, so you can actually see the original pitch in the back of this new edition of book two with the bonus materials. I have the original pitch that I sent to my agent and editor. So the funny thing that happened was the editor who ended up buying said, I love book one. We definitely want to do book one, and and I'm willing to talk about a series. But of the next two pitches, I don't like the pitch for book two. I like the pitch for book three, but I like the title for book two. So can we just like keep the title and use this plot
Well,
instead of the other plot? And I was like, I haven't written any of this. I just made
yeah,
this
yeah.
last
You're like,
week, so
okay.
fine. Let's go with that. And so I literally had the title Kangaroo Too, Too, and then wrote a completely different book than what I
That's
was.
awesome.
So yeah, but I was already thinking about it, and like,
Yeah.
and in the last few years, like when this series, like the publisher didn't want to continue it, I was still so I have drafts for like three more of these, including the third one, which I'm finalizing now. And I tried writing other kinds of books, and I've written other short stories and done other writing projects, like the stuff with Realm, which used to be Serial Box. They're like audio, like fiction podcasts, which was really cool and interesting and different because they're collaborative, like team writing setups, and it was like an episodic like series,
Oh,
so
interesting.
very
Yeah.
much modeled after like TV writing, which I've also been interested in for a long time. As a a TV watcher for many
Yeah.
years.
Yeah.
Just as I was becoming like starting to publish stuff and like and getting to like writing more seriously, just thinking about like what it takes to actually like not just write a whole TV show with like a bunch of other people, but to like do it on an ongoing basis, right? Like
Yeah. Yeah.
like
Having to
the sort
show
of
up with ideas like on a weekly
yeah.
basis or
Yeah,
regular
and
basis.
like sort of the extreme end of the spectrum is like soap operas, right? Where you need to put out a new show like every weekday, and you're gonna like
Yeah.
just keep churning out story, and maybe like things get ridiculous, or like you like storylines or like whatever, and you like have this big cast of characters you can play with, but like you have to generate like something that's gonna be interesting for someone else to watch, and
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
So chat asked, and
Mhm.
you alluded to a couple of things that are in the author's notes, but what sort of things changed between the original book and the author's edition? So did you just add stuff, or did you actually do any edits? How did you handle that?
I edit things very lightly because, like I said, I was very happy with the original books when they came out, And so the only things I've actually changed are, a little bit of copy editing. Like I found a couple more typos that were still in there,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
like there's always something.
That's
Some,
always going to happen. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
And then also like changing, and I say this in the introduction to both of these new editions, like changing some of the language I was using, just because um, in recent years I've become more aware of, what um what certain words might mean to different people. And
yeah,
so
yeah,
one specific thing is like in the original books, and this is, it's a science fiction thing where you want to talk about like colonies on other planets, but um, colony
yeah,
has a lot
yeah.
of,
It
implications.
is
And
it's baggage.
yeah, exactly. So I
Yeah,
basically like went through and found different words to use for all that, and it doesn't change the story at all. But for me, like it changes, like I've learned stuff in recent years, and so I
yeah,
want to apply
yeah,
some of that learning. And also for me, like I always wanted to portray us, just a slightly better future, right? Like
yeah, yeah,
there's still problems. Like there's still, there's still war, there's still spies and like, all this kind of stuff. But I wanted, at least some things to be a little bit better. So like there's not really any, over like racism or sexism or anything like that
yeah, yeah,
and so
yeah,
I was sort of very careful to like go back and make sure that, did I actually do a decent job of that, and so I can sort of carry that forward.
yeah.
So yeah. And
So
then some of
can
the
oh,
yeah,
sorry.
no, and then just like little terminology things
Yeah,
with
yeah,
the like science fictiony stuff.
yeah. That's awesome. No, I actually think that's really cool because it's like it's the whole thing of as you learn better, do better,
Hmm.
it's and
Yeah.
it's being able to go back and say, okay, I recognize this could be a problem for some people and I want to honor that
Hmm.
and fix
Yeah.
it. And,
Yeah,
yeah.
and I have to admit that there are definitely things that I would write differently now. But again, I didn't want to change the story fundamentally.
Yeah,
Like I didn't want
yeah,
to completely rewrite the books, both for like time and effort, and also just to like, this is what they are, and this is,
yeah, yeah,
kind of who I was
yeah.
when I wrote them. But I think I don't remember who it was. There was an online review at one point from a reader who had enjoyed the books, but their big complaint was that the kangaroo character was, uh, and this is like I remember this verbatim because he said he was annoyingly heterosexual. Like I feel like this is probably from a young person, but that's like yeah, like he is because like I am. Yes, and that's sort of what default was coming from. But like, again, in recent years, I've seen more and more and more. I'm like, oh yeah, I recognize that this is an issue, like people talking
Yeah,
about
yeah,
gender and all this kind of stuff.
right,
And yeah,
right.
I would hope in the future that there's a lot more acceptance of, things like that, shouldn't really matter to anyone but, but the person who's living that
Yeah,
experience.
yeah,
Um, so I'm trying to think about like, are there sort of opportunities? And again, because it's a spy thriller, it's like it's not really about some of these other things, but any chance I have to sort of feature things in the future world just to
yeah,
show people, it's like, oh, like this thing exists and it's not an issue for anyone. It's fine.
yeah,
Like
yeah.
we don't
No,
have to
it's
worry
it's
about it.
it's such an interesting thing to think about
Hmm.
because there's so many things, I feel like, I think about my own journey too, and the same kinds of things where you realize that so many things are baked in that you don't even
Yeah,
realize that you're
yeah,
doing something until someone calls it to your attention and you kind of go, "Oh, yeah, yeah, I guess you're right." And
yeah.
so, yeah, so
Yeah,
maybe,
exactly. Yeah, and the
but
one thing that I'm kind of wrestling with a little more right now, there's sort of a tangential thing in the third book I'm revising now about um so I mean historically, right, if we're talking about spies and espionage, um a lot of different people have used sex basically, right?
yeah,
Like
yeah,
either
Yeah.
to like, you seduce someone to get information from them, or like you are blackmailing someone because they're
They did
closeted
something.
and you can use
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
against them. And so like those are sort of like very, very established spy tropes. Um, but I don't necessarily want that to be a thing in in my
Yeah. Yeah.
future for Kangaroo. Like
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't want that to be like a problem, right? Like I don't want people to be like be able to be threatened by being outed. Like obviously there's certain other things like you could threaten someone with. Like I don't want to do that. But then like I tried to play a little bit with the like there are certain things in both books so far where I'm trying to subvert some of these tropes around
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know what people expect sort of a fictional spy to be like, or what the spy
Yeah.
sort of the mission looks like. And
If
so I'm
you,
trying to think a little bit more about that, if someone is like the whole there's this whole concept of a lot of espionage is still dependent on human intelligence. Like you want to
yeah.
get the right
Yes.
person to tell
Very much
you
so.
the secret
Yeah.
that you want, and you really have to do it, like person to person. It's not all going to be on computers or
Yeah. Yeah.
and so there's this concept of like developing an asset, whereas like
Right.
basically you
Right.
become friends with someone, they don't know you're a spy, and you're like just like hang out at the bar with them, or like you're like getting
Yeah.
into this, for you, it's a fake romantic relationship with them, and
Yeah.
maybe like
Yeah.
like sleeping with them and like doing all this stuff, and like
Yeah.
and so in a lot of there's a lot of interesting spy stories about how how deep does that go, right? Like if you're doing this but you're faking it, like are you really faking it at a certain point, and like
Yeah.
how do you disentangle yourself from this legend, they call it a legend, that you've created. um, and so I'm trying to think about how I might, how that kind of issue might present itself to Kangaroo, but not in
Yeah.
like a problematic, like you're gonna, have sex with these people to get information sort of way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I was thinking, those of you who are watching now or watching, well, are gonna watch this, watching later, some of what you're talking about is there on Curtis's website, there is a sample chapter, and you know what it is it's a sample newsletter. It's where you sign up for your newsletter
Oh,
and
yeah,
you
yeah,
say you can see a sample of my newsletter. And the chapter that is featured in that sample
yeah,
newsletter is basically this some of this
yeah, I did,
trope and
yeah.
playing
I
around with
did
some of that
post that a
trope.
while
So
ago, I
you'll have
remember.
to go
Yeah.
you'll have to go
Yeah,
read
so
because
I'm gonna leave that up, but that scene may change in the final version of book three.
yeah.
That's like
Yeah.
kind of the thing and again, it's there's a lot of things that sort of all sort of converge, because you know I want it to be a spy story specifically. Like I said, like I want the problems to be these spy type of problems. I don't want it to be just a guy trying to do some like generic job. Like he has a very
Yeah.
specific
Yeah.
job and have
Yeah.
very specific
Yes.
problems, but also like have being able to use this superpower, but not always in the most effective way for various reasons, because there it is a future and like other people have like science fictiony like countermeasures possibly, and also like him being having this very like snarky personality where he will push back against like even his boss because he knows like he's special, he can get away with a lot more than other
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
maybe, but he wants to do the job, but he's like maybe I don't want to do it that way, or once he's out and on his own like unsupervised, he's like yeah, I'm just gonna do it this way, like.
Yeah. So I have one like this is kind of like a big giant question, and I don't
Mm,
expect you to have like a nice tidy answer because I'm kind of hitting you up with it. I didn't give Curtis any of these questions
okay,
ahead of
no,
time,
it's
but
fine.
I was on the website, and
Yeah,
I was going down the list of some of your online
okay, yeah,
stories.
mm,
So stuff that I could access online
yeah,
without having subscribed to magazines or whatever.
hmm,
And thought that I think what's really fascinating to me is the breadth of it. Like there's all kinds of different things, but like I read one where their disability is really profoundly represented, and then there was one about death, and then Kangaroo,
Okay,
who's,
yeah.
very snarky, and I kind of wonder, like, is there for you an underpinning to what you write? Like, is it mostly about, oh, I like to explore, like, you know, where things can go if the future has limitless possibilities? Like, for you, what do you want your writing to do, or what do you like to do with your writing? What do you like to play around with? If there's kind of if Do you see there being an overarching thing, or is it just kind of whatever comes to you at the time? And
Hmm. Uh, so I did not think about this until I did the Clarion West writing workshop. Wow, it's like almost, it'll be 10 years ago this summer. Um, and so for those who don't know, it's a residential writing workshop. So you go live in this house with, it was like 18 or 19 other writers for 6 weeks, and every week they bring in a new instructor. So it's very intensive. A lot of people call it like a boot camp for writers. It was a great experience. Um, and traditionally in like week five out of six, they'll bring in editor, or like sometimes it's an editing team, like of two people who and the idea is that at that point you've spent 4 weeks. The idea is you're going to write a new piece every week and get a critique, and you're going to read other people's pieces and critique them, and you're going to talk about all this and get to know your classmates and sort of really really work on the writing, and really focus on it, because you're living there. You're like,
yeah.
you know eat, sleep, breathe writing, and you're really like just doing this for that time. um and so in week five, our editor was Charlie Jane Anders, and she came in, and
Cool.
she's amazing. Like, I have no idea how she does all the stuff she does still. But she had read, so you submit an application piece with your application to get in the workshop initially. And so all the instructors come in like having read that, right? So they can like get to know the student a little before they show up, and have an idea of where you are at in terms of both your craft, and also, like you're saying, like what kind of stuff you're writing about. But Charlie Jane, when she came in, she had taken the time to not only read our application pieces, but also the stories from the previous 4 weeks, like for all 20 of
Oh,
us,
wow.
which is a lot. But
Yeah.
she just had that much energy. um, and it was really great, because then every week you also do a one-on-one. So like you have half hour, just you and the instructor, to talk about whatever you like. Um, and that was also really great for me, because this is a totally another story. But like, I actually signed my agent when I was at the workshop, so like I had a lot
Oh,
of
cool.
friendships
Yeah.
in the first like week two, week three, for like those instructors. Like, so what should I be looking at in the contract for the agent? Um, that's another story. But so Charlie Jane, when she sat down for the one-on-one for each of us, she was able to say, like, these are the themes I'm seeing in your body of work, and let's talk about like why you think you're writing about this shit all the time, basically. And
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
me, she said to me, like, I see in a lot of these pieces, like, um, the concern is with how like organizations like fail or fall apart or don't serve the people that they're supposed to, and how the characters deal with that. And I had to stop and think about it. I was like, yeah, I guess you're right. I guess I do care about that a lot. Thanks. And
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
but I think she's like, so she was very insightful on that. And she like, and something else she wrote like a few years later also kind of resonated with me, where she was talking about the difference between Star Trek and Star Wars, which you can't see. I also have a lightsaber over here. So I am a
Yay.
fan of both, but for different reasons. And Charlie Jane, she wrote, I think this might have been her newsletter, but she wrote this essay about how basically she boiled it down to like, Star Trek is generally about people like trying to build things together, and Star Wars is about people uh, getting together to blow things up, basically.
Yeah.
Right.
Tearing down versus, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and I thought that was really interesting because, obviously, like both franchises, they've grown so much that there are a lot of different stories possible in both
yeah, yeah,
universes, but sort of as what they sort of started as, or what the initial idea behind each one was. It's like this is the kind of story that they're kind of initially designed to tell. And so, and I feel like that made a lot of sense to me. It's like, oh yeah, like I actually have generally more affinity for a lot of the Star Trek stories because they are about like, some kind of problem, and often it is sort of this problem that affects a group of people, or like we're trying to like do something for this collective of an organization, and something is failing in there, and people have to figure out how to fix it, and maybe it's technological, maybe it's something else. um, and yeah, so I feel like a lot of my stories have ended up still like dealing with that, and again, that's comes down to
yeah, yeah.
who I am, and this stuff that I care about in life.
Yeah, no, I think that's an interesting question. I think I might have to start asking everybody that because I think it is interesting how pieces of things that we care about
Hmm.
inevitably make it into our work. A lot of times, even when we don't really realize it, because it's
Hmm.
in,
Oh yeah,
we think
absolutely.
we're creating this wholly new creative, oh, I've never done anything like this before. And yet those
Hmm.
things will still sneak into
Yeah,
it
sure.
because they're part
Yeah,
of our DNA and what we care about. And
right.
yeah,
Yeah, and so I'm grateful that Charlie Jane pointed it out to me at
yeah,
that
yeah,
time, because I've kind of noticed it more myself now. And in like you were saying, in some of the recent stories, like there's definitely, I feel like always, and this is true in Kangaroo too, where like there's always this question of like how the individual fits into the larger institution, right? Like, and
yeah, yeah,
whether they are, you know maybe they are fully devoted to it, but then they find out like there's something wrong with it, or they're pushing back against it, and then something else happens. But there's always that sort of, I think for me, there's always that kind of tension, because it's something I kind of deal with a lot in in real life too. I guess it's like
yeah,
how, and I guess everyone like has questions like that, like where do I fit in this world? Where does it make sense for me to, you know, um, to make a contribution to other people, whether it is something like that's very sort of organized, or even in terms of like just what you're putting out into the world generally with your art.
yeah, yeah. Well, I'm looking at the clock and realizing that we have been having a very lovely conversation for about an hour.
Oh, all right.
I
Yeah,
figured that
no,
would
no.
happen because, we had a lot of things to talk about. But I want to give everybody an opportunity who's in chat. If you had any questions that you want to post really quickly of anything that we've talked about, please go ahead and do that. And while you're thinking about whether you have a question, I always
Mhm.
ask my authors at the end so that people have a minute to think about a question is, do you have a book that you have read recently that you really love that you would recommend to other people?
Recently, yes. I actually, I'm in a book club with some friends, and we just talked about a Spindle, by Alix Harrow.
I love that one.
Yeah, which is it's very short also. Like we
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
and it's the first of two books, and the second one is A Mirror Mended, and they're
yeah,
both sort of fairy, well, like they're
yeah.
directly talking
They're
about fairy
retelling.
tales,
Yeah, yeah,
but in kind of a meta sort of way,
yeah.
but also they're a lot of fun. So
Yes,
I
yeah,
think even as like my wife is more of a like, I read more science fiction. I tend to, and my wife has tended to read more fantasy, and so she knows a lot about fairy tales. And like I also have friends who are like actual like folklorists who've like studied this, and there's like a whole classification system for folk,
yeah, yeah,
which is really interesting. Is um, but just thinking about sort of the the kinds of stories that people tell and how different variations of those stories sort of imply different things about who's
Yeah.
telling it or
Yeah.
what kind of message they're trying to convey. um yeah, for me as a writer, like apart from just the fact that it was like this fun sort of adventure, as a writer it was interesting to think about, like, oh, like this is a way to think about story. And in the book it sort of directly sort of relates, like a person's story in terms of like what's happening to you in your life, and how you're trying to sort of write your own ending to your story
Yeah. Yeah.
and deal with that.
So that's it. Just so folks know, that's an Alix Harrow book.
Hmm.
It's a novella. The second one is also a novella.
Yep.
And we don't have the paperbacks in the store. But we have they put it together in like a mini omnibus.
Yeah.
It sounds weird to call it that because there's only two of them, but they basically they bound the stories together into
Hmm.
one book. So you can get them as separate books or you can get the little omnibus edition.
Yeah.
But yeah, I really like them. They're very good. And
Yeah.
several people in chat said, "Yay," when you
Mhm.
mentioned that. So I think
Yeah.
a lot of people have
Yeah,
read
no,
them.
it's a lot of fun. Yeah, and I would definitely recommend getting both of them together because
Yeah, they're fun.
yeah.
I was kind of hoping she would do more, but I don't know if
Yeah.
that's kind of what she's gonna
Yeah.
what she's gonna do. But um I don't see any questions pop up, so we can wrap up. Remind me, do you have an estimated date or even like a month time of the summer or whatever for the third one? I know that you're
Uh,
still working on edits
yeah.
and that not, so it's
Yeah.
hard to pin down an actual
Yeah.
date, but
So I don't think it's gonna be summer, like full disclosure.
okay, okay. That's
I,
okay. That's okay.
yeah. It is. All right. You know what? I'm gonna say it here, so it's on the record. But I've been thinking that I will aim for October 1st because it's a Tuesday, which is traditionally book release day,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
for reasons. And also October 1st is my birthday, so like I will be motivated to like get things done before then.
Yeah,
And it's
yeah.
actually gonna have to be like a couple months before then for production and all
Right,
that.
right.
But it's still much faster than like with working with Macmillans. Like I had to submit the manuscript, and then it was like a year and a half
Yes,
or
yeah.
more. Usually, like typically, it takes about 2 years from the time an author finishes the book, the time when you can buy it, if people don't know that. So, like,
I'm
and there's a
laughing
reason for
because
that. Like, there's like marketing stuff that has to happen, there's
yeah,
promotion stuff,
yes.
and
All
also
the
production.
printing and
Yeah, yeah,
distributing and
yeah.
yeah.
So, yeah,
I'm laughing because Kate said, "You're on the record."
yeah. So, I mean,
Well, we
something's
won't
going to
hold you
be out.
to it if it doesn't work out because publishing is funky. Even, honestly, whether you're doing it yourself
Mhm.
and you're playing all the roles or you have a publisher that's playing some of the roles,
Yeah.
it's things can happen. But
Yeah, no, but
so
I'm
Paul,
optimistic. Yeah,
Paul is is
yeah,
is
yeah.
reading.
I got some really good notes from I hired a freelance editor to look over the current manuscript, and she gave me some really good notes. So I'm working off those now, and I like have a very clear idea of like things to revise and then tweak a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. Good. Well, we're excited. That's exciting. So book
Yep.
one's in the store right
Yep.
now. We have signed copies. Book two is coming to the store this week.
Yep.
So
I'll
and it
bring
is
that.
on the pre-order page. So if you are wanting to pre-order it, you can do that. But like Curtis said, if you are an ebook reader, we don't have the ebooks through us, but you have it on, can they go through your website and do the ebook reader or the ebook
Yeah,
through your
yeah.
website? Okay.
Yeah, my
So,
website is Curtis C. Chen with the middle initial
okay. Yeah.
.com. And then if you go to curtiscchen.com/kangaroo, spelled the normal way,
Yeah.
you can you'll get links to both books, and there click through to the buy
Okay.
links, and
Yeah. So
I
if you want a
think all
paper
the
copy,
yeah.
look, hit us up. We can ship if you're not local. And but if you are a digital person, hit up Curtis's website so you can do that.
Yeah.
Try to think of anything that's happening in the near future. I wanted to see. I am talking to I'm talking to Sonia Thomas next week, who's a local middle grade writer.
Sounds
I
great.
saw Jen in the chat. I'm going to be
Sounds great
talking to
too.
Jen on the 21st because their new book's coming out very soon too. So yeah, we've got full lineup through June of local authors that we're going to be talking to. So keep an eye on the website. I've got to update it. There's only like 2 left, and I'm like, oh shoot, I got to spend some time getting them all up there. But we're running through June so far for Vintage Book Live. Children's Book Week is next week, and I know that Val had some ideas planned for that. And the other thing I wanted to be sure to mention is if you are in the vicinity of Clark College, which is just off of I-5, just over the river from Portland. So if you're in Portland, but like on the northeast or north side of Portland, or if you're anywhere in Clark County, Clark College is having their Writers Festival this week or next week. And it's open to the public and it's free, and they've got events going on all week. And then on Saturday, they've got workshops all day, Saturday the 11th. So definitely look that up if you're of the writing persuasion, because I think that's going to be a fun event that they're doing. And like I said, it's free and open to the public. So go check that out too. So thank you so much, Curtis. I really,
Yeah,
really
yeah.
appreciate it. This
Thank
was
you,
really fun.
Christy. Yeah, this was
Have a
great.
good night, everybody. Thank you for